Achtung, Achtung. Hello, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. Today, given that it's Remembrance Sunday, we thought we would talk about remembrance. Because after all, on this podcast, we talk about the operational level, the tactical level, the strategic, the tales of daring do, the kit, the gear, the things that we, the new ways of looking at it, old ways of looking at it, all the myriad of things that the Second World War offers. But at the heart of the subject is, after all, death, loss, and consequently remembrance. Who has joined us today?
We've got Glyn Prysor here, who is a historian. He's written a brilliant book called Citizen Sailors about the Royal Navy in the Second World War, and he was also the former historian of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And I thought it'd be interesting to call upon Glyn to kind of give us a bit of background about Fabian Ware and the start of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and how it all began and why it is what it is, and why is it that when you travel overseas and you suddenly find this little corner of England and it all looks exactly the same, because it's such a sort of, you know, in our remembrance, I think those cemeteries, those carved headstones, it's such a part of the kind of our culture, isn't it, and our culture of remembrance.
Well, Glyn, welcome. I notice over your shoulder on your bookshelf there's a book that's 1916 down its spine, and that's really where this all begins, isn't it? Is that you have all of a sudden the nature of conflict has changed for Britain. Previously, armies are siphoned from the scum of the earth, Wellingtonian classes, and the officer class, which is people who are from military families or fourth sons of bankrupt nobles, as it were. That's the pencil sketch. But the difference with the First World War is suddenly everyone's involved, and suddenly it necessarily changes remembrance.
Absolutely. Hello, guys. It's good to be with you. And, I think that the First World War changes everything in terms of the way that the British Empire does remembrance. And what was then called the Imperial War Graves Commission was set up at the height of the fighting, 1917, in many ways the kind of nadir, the low point for the British Empire. And there's this kind of extraordinary vision of remembrance, or a kind of form of commemoration that would endure, that would, at once it would kind of mark the achievements of the armies, of all of the soldiers from across the British Empire who fought, but would also honour them kind of in perpetuity. What had happened earlier, for centuries, was that ordinary people didn't necessarily have a grave that would last. There wasn't a given that any kind of form of commemoration and memorial would last the test of time. So the idea was to set up something that would endure, that would still be there in perpetuity, and that would mark not just the exploits, but also the sacrifices of all of those who took part. And it's something that, of course, is so familiar to us today, but at the time it was very new. Because
after all, the Waterloo battlefield, if you had money, your body might get taken home, brought back to England. I mean, this is the English soldiers or British soldiers fighting for Wellington, because after all, his army, we don't need to go into that, it's from all over. The common men, they're bunged in a mass grave and forgotten about, basically, aren't they?
This is the big difference. So, with the First World War, particularly after conscription comes in halfway through the war for Britain, you've got, it's a democratic zeitgeist almost. This is at the same time as voting rights being extended across Britain. The idea that everyone had contributed to this kind of international effort, really led to that sense that you had to do something for these ordinary soldiers. And the two key elements, I think, in creating what we're so familiar with today is, number one, not bringing the bodies home. You've touched on it. That was a big deal. That meant that what you would do is create cemeteries in the places where people died. And that's why today we have cemeteries and memorials all over the world. And the second thing was that every headstone would be uniform. There'd be no distinction between the wealthy and the poor. And that, in many ways was the more controversial issue, particularly for the wealthier families who wanted to build these grand memorials to their sons. The idea that everyone would be the same, and particularly if you wanted a cross, you couldn't have a cross. The headstones are uniform. They're those familiar rectangular shapes because, of course, the religions that people came from across the empire were so diverse as well. So, at the time, it kind of seems to us now that this was almost an inevitable thing. It speaks to us so much in the modern world, in the 21st century. The idea that everyone should be the same and everyone should be treated equally. But at the time, incredibly controversial.
But Glyn, I mean, just how did it sort of come about? Because it was this rather remarkable fellow called Fabian Ware who sort of kicked the ball in the first place, wasn't he? And sort of got the whole ball rolling. And then there's this really extraordinary committee gets developed to kind of sort of go, okay, well, we're going to do this, but this is how it should look.
That's right. I mean, Fabian Ware is the kind of driving force behind it, and he is often held up as the kind of architect of all of this. He was working with a Red Cross unit on the Western Front. He was too old to fight himself. And he realised that there was a problem with marking graves, registering graves. He really pushed the military, the army, to take this under their wing. And he had this amazing kind of set of skills and experiences that made him perfect. He'd served in South Africa in the Boer War, where he'd seen what happened to the graves of ordinary soldiers. He was a Francophile, he could speak French, really useful in terms of, liaising with the French authorities. He was a newspaperman, so he knew how to sell a story. He was really well connected with the royal family and with the kind of establishment in Britain. So all of this stuff came together to make him really the perfect kind of conduit for this spirit of wanting to do something.
So he's going around rattling the tin, trying to get money together for this. How does he go about that? Because I know my father looked into the mini cenotaph we have in Stukely in Buckinghamshire, in the village I grew up in, and that there was a committee, and then there's national remembrance, there's local remembrance, joining the two up, finding the money for it, how you coordinate across villages. So, for instance, in Stukely, there's a guy who's on the War Memorial in Salisbury as well. He's in two villages because he was a local bigamist. He had a family in each village, so he's commemorated in both villages. How does he start to join this up, and where's he getting the money from?
Well, the big difference in the First World War in the War Graves Commission is that it's an international, an empire effort. So, but it's effectively a state effort, and this is incredibly new. And this is, apart from everything else, this is possibly the most controversial thing. As you said, there's a kind of tapestry of remembrance, little local personal memorials, families doing their own thing, local villages and towns getting committees together, local businessmen, that kind of thing. This is different. This is the state not only taking kind of ownership of bodies and taking responsibility for them, but also paying for this to happen, paying for the kind of commemoration of individual families. And before that, the only time this really happens is if you've got a kind of pauper's grave. The idea that the state would pay for your grave is really quite new and quite uncomfortable for people who come from a kind of Victorian sense of kind of funerals and that kind of tradition.
Well, which after all, funeral culture is a Victorian invention anyway. The sort of whole commercialisation and creation of funeral culture and the enormous sort of funereal gardens and cemeteries outside London that you could, commute to Waterloo from and all that sort of thing. That's all a Victorian invention anyway. So this is a disruption of that newly established tradition, isn't it?
It is. And, the idea that you would need the state to give you a handout to pay for your grave is, really anathema to lots of people. I didn't like that idea. And it took a while for it was only really when the plans for what these places would look like, what this was really all about, started to filter through that people became much more comfortable with this idea.
But Glyn, isn't one of the key markers, isn't that when the Prince of Wales comes on board?
Yes. So this is kind of 1917. You've got, this is another really important element of this. It's an imperial endeavour. So it's not just Britain doing its own thing, it's an empire effort. So there are representatives from across the dominions as they were then, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand. There are representatives for South Africa and for India, for the colonies as well. And so, from the beginning, Fabian Ware recognises that this has to be an imperial effort. And part of the reason for that is that he doesn't want the British government to get their hands on this, particularly Alfred Mond, the kind of director of works. And there's this real tussle between those two guys over who's going to be in control of this. And in the end, Fabian Ware manages to get get his hands on this commemoration. For Alfred Mond, they gave him the project which became the Imperial War Museum, almost as a payoff. He gets that, he gets the War Museum. Fabian Ware gets to do his great scheme for this Empire commemoration, and that's really what removes it from the grasp of the British government. And still, even today, that's a really important part of the Commission's work. It's a cross Commonwealth organisation. So, but from the very beginning, the idea was you commemorate the Empire and all of the people from across the Empire who fought.
And this is about a shifting idea of basically of a sort of social contract, isn't it, between the Empire and its subjects, as it were. That if you're asking, because after all, in German states in the 19th century, if you're a rifleman, you got the vote. That was your active citizenship qualification. And there's an element of that in this, isn't there? That in a way, and also this idea that you can't ask people to join a mass army and give their lives and not commemorate them. That you're not going to be able to mobilise people, and it's as much part of, or smart people will know it's as much part of that. It's a morale thing as much as anything else. Is that you're not going to be forgotten.
Yeah, and I think the fact that this happens during the war is really important as well. The idea that they were already. As I said, at some of the hardest moments of the war for Britain, already planning for the future and what would happen, and that whether you were, a major general or a private soldier, you'd have the same treatment. That's really important.
Glyn, tell me a little bit about the commission, because it's Sir Frederick Kenyon, who is the director of the British Museum, is the guy who's put in charge of that. And there's some really interesting characters that are brought in, not least, of course, Lutyens, the famous architect, Rudyard Kipling. He's the guy who comes up with the immortal line, known unto God and their name liveth forevermore and all this kind of stuff. And there's sort of celebrity gardeners, aren't there, who are sort of all brought in, which gives it, and it's this commission, as I understand it, that work on the look of these cemeteries, which are now so familiar. The Crusader's sword, there's a debate about that, isn't there, and the cross. And there's certain things that all these cemeteries have, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, Fabian Ware is often given the credit for all of this, but actually the great thing that he does is brings all of these guys together. It's like the A-team of commemoration in the First World War, It's like the kind of the poet of empire Kipling. You've got the greatest architects of the day in Britain, Blomfield, Lutyens, Baker, and also actually lots of junior architects, people who'd fought during the war, veterans who were brought in to help those kind of great men develop these ideas. And often they're the guys who actually do the legwork. As ever, the big names get the credit, but it's a whole load of people working as a team to do this, including people
and Gertrude Jekyll.
Gertrude Jekyll, yeah, and people from the Kew Gardens, who actually go out to the battlefields while the war's still being fought and have a look and look at the ground, look at how they can best make these places beautiful. But already by the end of the war, the army and what was called the graves registration units, they're already marking graves. They're already setting up little cemeteries on the battlefields, making them beautiful, even taking photos of the graves to send home to relatives. So all of this kind of evolves as they go through.
So what happens to if it comes into being in 1917? How is it that all those who were killed in 1914, 15 and 16, before it's come into being, how do they then end up in these cemeteries? Why are they not all just shoved in a big pit like everyone has been in the past?
Well, it's partly because they were buried at the time by their comrades. So if you imagine the earliest part of the fighting in 1914, in somewhere like Ypres, you've got little battlefield cemeteries, towns behind the lines where people are buried, and further back as well in the kind of medical centres. One of the big problems that they had in the First World War, of course, and we'll come on to the second and how it's different, but lots of people's graves from those early years were lost. As the fighting went to and fro, where people had been buried, maybe they were blown up by artillery, maybe the records were just lost. And so what you get at the end of the First World War is a huge number of missing. Of about 1 million dead of the British Empire, about half of them are missing. They have no known grave. And so a big problem that you had is not just creating cemeteries and kind of formalising cemeteries that were already there. You have to work out how to commemorate people who don't have a grave, who don't have a marked grave. And that's why you get these huge memorials to the missing. Places like the Menin Gate in Ypres, 55,000 names. Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, 72,000 names. These huge memorials. Again, that principle of uniformity, every name the same in those long lists by regiment. I'm sure many of the listeners will have been and visited these places. That, aside from anything else, is the big difference in the First World War. The fact that you've got these memorials on the battlefields, whether you've got a grave or whether you don't have a grave, you're treated in the same way.
How was the headstone settled on? I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners know this, but how do they arrive at this design? Because I'm sort of loath to use the word, but it is an iconic design. It's instantly recognisable, and like you say, the uniformity of the is a big part of the approach that they decide on, as a not just as an aesthetic as well as a simple policy. How do they arrive at the headstone?
Well, as ever, there's a committee, and people put in their advice, and then Kenyon and various other bigwigs decide on what they're going to do. But I think it's worth thinking a little bit about what's actually on the headstone. The first thing is this kind of military identity. This is something we underestimate today. When you look at that headstone, what you get first is the military identity, the number, the rank, the name, and any awards that were given, DSO, VC, whatever it is. And you've got a religious symbol. So the big debate was over whether you should allow people to have a cross. Whether the headstone should be cruciform. And that's the thing that really gets the kind of people writing into the Times and various things like that. That's the thing that's controversial. The idea that you wouldn't allow people to have a cross. But actually, when we look back, we see what a good idea that was, because when you look at those cemeteries, you don't get a random selection of different shapes and sizes. They're all uniform, almost like soldiers on parade.
Yes,
and again, that's part of it.
In a US graveyard, there are crosses, except there's the odd Star of David here and there, and all that sort of thing. Because they've adopted a different approach in that respect, haven't they?
Absolutely. And if we go back to what the architects of the Commission were trying to do, they're trying to commemorate the Empire. They're trying to talk about how great the British Empire is. And the big problem they have at that time is India. The big thing that they're all worried about is that the empire's going to splinter and that it's been weakened, and they want to kind of bolster this idea of imperial effort. And if you ignore all of the Muslims and the Hindus and the Sikhs from the Indian Empire, then you've got a real problem. So I think, that is a big decision, big controversial decision. But the other thing that you've got on a headstone, of course, that I think is probably the most touching thing, the most poignant thing when you go and visit, is the inscription from the family at the bottom. That personal message from the loved
and how
one.
does that work? How are they allowed a certain number of letters?
They are. And again, this is a kind of controversial element, whether they would be allowed them or not. The first time round, they ask for a contribution, a monetary contribution. So they pay by the letter, almost like sending a telegram. And today that seems a bit weird to us. Why on earth would they ask families to pay? But it goes back to that Victorian idea that families would want to contribute something towards the commemoration. And so you get all kinds of different things, biblical quotes, you get messages about, God and king and empire. And you also get these really kind of personal messages about loved ones missing them at home, and messages from daughters and sons. And there's a huge variety of different messages on there that I think give them that personal touch alongside the military identity. You've got the military and the civilian identity in one. And in a way, that's the genius of it. That's the big thing that I think makes it so touching today.
I remember standing in the cemetery just below the tennis court in Kohima and looking at this chap from the 1st Dorsets. I think it was the 1st Dorset. Anyway, the Dorset Regiment, just down the road from me. And he was, I think, 20, 21. And the inscription was, to the world he was a soldier, but to us he was the world. And it was just, you just thought, Jesus, his mum and dad are never going to come over and see him. It's just too far away. And it's just heartbreaking. It really is.
Well, which leads me, James talking about Kohima there. Who's looking after those, to bring it up to today, who's looking after those graves? How's that paid for? How's that managed? How's it managed in a country that might be chaotic or not exactly one of our modern day friends. How's that organised and paid for?
Well, that's a really good question. In terms of the money, the money comes from the member governments. So the UK contributes about 80% through the Ministry of Defence, but Canada contributes, South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, India as well. So it's a kind of combined effort. But, this problem of how do you operate in places that are difficult goes all the way back to the First World War and through the Second World War. And now there are teams on the ground all over the world that work really hard to maintain these places. And, if you think of somewhere like Iraq, war graves from the First World War, from the Second World War, and from more recent conflicts as well, of course. The great thing with the commission is that it's meant to be in perpetuity. So the idea is that, if there's trouble for a few years, you wait, you bide your time, and then you come back in when things are improving and you get back there. And, throughout its history, over 100 years now, there've been all kinds of conflicts and difficulties, not least the Second World War, of course. But the commission has always been able to come back in due course and maintain that. And really, it's the men and women all over the world that do that hard graft and look after these places. And the budget's about 60 million. So in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount of money, and it goes an awful long way. It's 150 different countries all around the world where it operates.
There are some amazing ones. I mean, I was talking to Al last night about this. One of the most beautiful is at Castiglione di Pepoli, which is sort of in the Apennines, just north of halfway between sort of Florence and Bologna. And it's just beautiful, sort of rolling hills and, the mountains in the distance, and a lot of South Africans there from the 6th South African Armoured Division. A lot of guardsmen as well, because their brigade was attached to them. And that's a particularly beautiful one. But I suppose the one that kind of I found the most remarkable was the one near Majerda, in the Majerda Valley, in northern Tunisia. And it's a really sort of dusty kind of sort of dry plain kind of, very red soil. And you go down this track and the tarmac runs out and you're sort of rattling along and you're thinking, where the hell is this place? It must have taken a wrong turn. And then suddenly there's a wall and this sort of canopy of trees, and you park outside, and inside it is the proverbial English garden. I mean, there are the rose trees, the perfectly manicured lawn. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. But I also think it's really interesting how other nations deal with it. I mean, we've touched on the United States, but the Germans also have a very different approach to it, which was, obviously begun in, I think, the late 1950s and mainly in the 1960s, where they didn't have any kind of uniformity. There was, they would put out to tender they'd say, okay, we're going to create a cemetery. They put out to tender, different architects would have different opinions. And some of them are absolutely awful. I mean, the one at the Futa Pass is just really, really depressing. The one at Alamein is really depressing. It's a mausoleum rather than a cemetery.
The one in the Ardennes at Bastogne as well is really grim.
It's really grim.
6 guys to a tiny grey headstone. I mean, it's awful.
But the one in Sicily, at Mr. Bianco, just north west of Catania, is just a thing of absolute beauty. It's in this beautiful kind of olive grove, overlooking the plain of Catania on the sort of southern slopes of Etna, and it's made with those kind of very thin Roman bricks. They're very distinct. They're much thinner than your normal brick, and it's a square block with 4 rooms. And you go up the steps, and in the first one is a catafalque of a kind of sort of prostrate, naked bronze man on the floor, which is very arresting to start off with. And then you've got these walls with further names, and you've got these stones on the ground, these sort of slabs with names on, and it's open to the heavens and to the skies, so it's got no roof on it, and it is a profoundly moving place. It's a real place of serenity and beauty, and it's amazing how I kind of sort of think they get it right and they get it wrong. And the other thing I thought was really, really interesting is if you go to Alamein in Egypt, you've got them all in a row. So you've got the British one, which just looks like all the other British ones. Then you've got the sort of rather grim and austere German mausoleum. And then you've got the Italian one, which just has permanent kind of sort of fanfare music playing the whole time, and flowers absolutely everywhere. And I don't know, it just sort of, each of those 3 seems to sort of conform to our kind of stereotypes of how we view those different countries. It's kind of funny, really.
Glyn, which is the smallest of the CWGC
Well, I mean, you would say that there are plenty of places where you've just got one grave or two graves. And I think the thing to remember above all is you don't have to go to abroad to kind of weird and wonderful places to see graves. We've got them right here in the UK. You can go to any local churchyard, you'll find war graves from the Second World War, particularly RAF crews, But, there are big kind of thousands of grave cemeteries and lots of little graves too. But actually one of the interesting differences between the Second and the First World War is that the First World War, you tend to think of these Western Front cemeteries, little ones dotted across the landscape. Second World War, they tend to be bigger. There tend to be fewer of them and bigger. And that's partly because they did things slightly differently during the Second World War. They didn't have as much money for a start. And so what they tended to do was, collect them, concentrate them into a few bigger cemeteries. So Alameин's a great example of that. They knew they couldn't have lots of cemeteries across the desert.
But they're generally speaking, they tend to be where there's been field hospitals or clearing stations or whatever.
That's right. And
is that right?
Yeah. So in the Second World War, the big thing that they've got going for them is they know what they're doing. First World War, they're making it up as they go along. Second World War, it's already established. And in fact, you've got some amazing photos of the Western Front before the German attack in May 1940. So you've got British soldiers visiting the cemeteries of the First World War in France and Belgium in 1939, 1940, and looking at the graves of the previous generation who fought that war. It's incredible. And then after the German invasion, you've got photos of German soldiers visiting those cemeteries too. In fact, if you go to the Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, you can walk right up inside it. There's a huge spiral staircase that goes up inside the memorial, and you can get right out onto the top of the memorial and look out over the battlefield. Incredible view. But the door that goes out onto that platform, there's German graffiti on the side of it from the Second World War, where German soldiers, it's obviously a lookout point or something like that, they left graffiti there. So they were visiting those cemeteries, those battlefields as well. And for me, that gives me kind of shivers. It's incredible to see those sites. And then, of course, in 1944 and 45, the Allies are fighting back through the same battlefields. And there's an amazing photo of Montgomery visiting Vimy, a place that Hitler had visited in 1940, one of the few places he actually bloody visited on his way over. And Monty goes there in late 1944, goes to the cemetery right next to the Vimy Memorial, Canadian Cemetery No. 2, and he goes to the grave of an unknown Staffordshire and kneels down at the grave and looks at it. And it's an amazing photo. It's worth Googling. We went there and I actually remember going and finding that grave that Monty had gone to look at. So there's this kind of, by the Second World War, there's already this tradition has been established. And so, the system in place is much better in the Second World War. And so you get far fewer missing. There aren't these big memorials to the missing. There are some, but the numbers of names on them are far fewer. In the Far East, there are a few big memorials to the missing because of things like the Burma Railway, where graves are much harder to record and to find.
Well, doesn't that also reflect that the Second World War, there's a different attitude to conflict as well, that it's not the glories of the imperial effort so much anymore. It's become even more democratised, which is, after all, the thing the army are worrying about the entire time. Is that it's a big part of their attitude to their men is that these guys are voters now. It's all changed. And again, you've got what you don't do is do great big flashy commemorations, or commemorations that could be regarded as flashy by some to the war dead, because things have changed. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, at the beginning of the Second World War, there was a debate about whether they should carry on with the same system. This is the war to end all wars in the First World War. Well, hang on a minute, it hasn't actually ended all wars. Should we do something different for the Second World War? Should we have a different design, a different approach? But actually, pretty quickly, it's decided that no, this should continue, that the War Graves Commission should carry on and do its thing for the Second World War as well. The idea that there's this kind of continuity of effort. And yeah, there's no question that repatriation again was an issue, but because that precedent had been set, because this idea of this is the way we do it was already there, that debate was much easier. But there are cultures still around the world where, repatriation for kind of various reasons is still a big problem. I remember meeting a Maori New Zealander called Witi Ipamara. We had a really interesting conversation about one of his family members who'd been killed in North Africa. And he was saying, look, in my culture, we need the body. We need to bring him home. We need to bury him and honour him in our way. Why can't we do this? And, that's a really difficult question to answer. It's not enough just to say, well, that's the policy. That's what we do, It's a really kind of still a very emotive issue for lots of people.
But that's a tension, isn't it, between the idea that all imperial subjects are equal under the empire, rather than under God, because we've removed God from the equation by allowing all religious symbols, haven't we? But in fact, how do you respect those local cultures within that system? I mean, I remember going to Crete. The graveyard at Crete is particularly beautiful. You drive through sort of water parks and shabby half-built buildings, and the sort of stuff you get in a place that's a holiday resort. You come down into this in a little bay, and again, rose bushes and lawns and signs of British or British imperial commemoration. And I remember standing there and looking, and there's lads from New Zealand and Yorkshire and all over the world, because after all, the Crete battle is sort of a waypoint and a shit scramble out of Greece anyway. So everyone's coming through. It's like an entrepot, military entrepot. So you've got people from everywhere. And I remember standing there and really, really thinking, God, what must it have been like to be a lad from New Zealand who's come up to fight in North Africa, probably, who ended up in Greece, is scarpering back out through New Zealand and gets caught and killed in the fighting here. And I obviously completely appreciate that a Maori guy from New Zealand saying my culture, but how it tells you the story of the war, how it shows you, and Jim and I talk about this a lot, that this is a genuinely global event in every sense of the description, and that there's a boy from New Zealand lying next to a guy from Yorkshire. And they're
next to a guy from the Punjab,
exactly, and with their officers, all these things all going on at once that I think really do tell a story of an imperial war, but a people's war as well, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And actually, I've been lucky enough to interview a few Maori who fought in the Second World War, and I remember going to the cemetery in Feederville, where there were a number of the Maoris. The 28th Maori Battalion was caught up in a very sharp fight at a place called Takruna in northern Tunisia, and it is really, really moving to see those Maori graves and to see them and see that some of the fellows that the guys I interviewed were talking about, and they're mates. And they, I talked to one guy called Mikey Parkinson who, he lost a leg at Takruna and he lost several of his really, really good mates, and there they all are. And such a long way from home. And I think that's the thing that really caught me when I was at Kohima. You look down and you just think, God, someone from, and what I didn't say was that it said, from, love always from mum afterwards. And it's pathetic in the truest sense of the word. This sort of is desperate that for someone in the 1940s, you literally couldn't be further from Dorset, being in Kohima and ending up being buried there.
You might as well be on the moon. Yeah,
you might as well be on the moon. Exactly that. It's fascinating. But Glyn, what is the process? So the process, as I understand it, it's certainly in the Second World War. If you die, your mates bury you. There's always chats in these and conversations in particularly in memoirs and diaries and stuff where they talk. I had to organise a burial party. We had to bury Charlie or whatever it is. So they get buried wherever they get buried. A rough cross is made if they're lucky. A rifle's put in with the helmet on top and the dog tags. You take one, you leave one, and at some point, the graves registration people turn up and disinter them and put them back into so you can end up being buried and disinterred and buried again sort of 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, that's right. And, in terms of telling a story, that can often, if you're really kind of geeky about it, you look into the data. If you go to somewhere like Bayeux War Cemetery, you can also almost see the little collections of graves. When you look at actually the website, the cwgc.org website's amazing. You can see all these documents if you really want to dig into it. But you can find groups of people who died at the same time. You can work out where they were originally buried, maybe close to the coast, close to the landing beaches, then where they were moved, to another kind of holding cemetery, and then buried finally in Bayeux. So you've almost got a kind of narrative, a story of that kind of burial process and that commemoration process as well. And that, I think, how lucky we are to have these places on the sites where it happened. I mean, Kohima is a great example.
I
and
totally
the fact
agree.
that the tennis court is almost built into the architecture of that cemetery.
Yes.
Or somewhere like Casino, you can look up, there's the mountain, there's the place where these people died, and this vast cemetery with all the people. So, yeah, I think, the idea that these places tell a story is so true. And each grave, each group of graves, tells all kinds of different stories, not just about the fighting, but also what happened afterwards.
Yeah, I'm doing some, as Al and regular listeners will know, I'm doing this work on the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry at the moment, and the Padre, one of the Padres that was attached to the 8th Armoured Brigade was specifically attached to the Sherwood Rangers, called Padre Leslie Skinner. And he was with them from sort of D-Day all the way through, and he made an absolute point of making sure that everyone got buried, even if they'd been in a tank and reduced to nothing. And he kept a book, a burial book and a casualty book, which one can still see at the Imperial War Museum, although the Regimental Association also sort of published it in a kind of sort of, in its as a sort of facsimile version with his own handwriting and all the rest of it. And it's a remarkable record, and he was extraordinary. And his diary is littered with kind of, I had to wait 3 days before I could get into that tank because it was so hot. And he would always scrape out something. He would always get something, even if it was, had been morphed mass of 5 men, because he felt it was absolutely his Christian duty to make sure that these men didn't remain in the belly of a cast iron, steel hull, that they were buried in the ground and properly remembered. And so he would mark all the graves, work out where they were, and he spent an awful lot of time after the battle, after the fighting, really just immediately after the fighting, accounting for absolutely everybody, making notes, making sure that they were recognised, making sure that he collected the dog tags, making sure that he'd notified people, and it's remarkable, really, and it's people like him, everyone just sort of doesn't think about, because it just sort of happens, but it doesn't just happen. There are people like him across the British Army and across the armed forces and across the Commonwealth forces doing similar sort of jobs, and it's remarkable, really.
Yeah, and the idea that they're going into battle somewhere like Normandy with crosses with them, ready to mark the graves. They know what's going to happen. And, again, in terms of morale and the kind of democratic, the people's war, it's a really important element of it, that the people know what's going to happen. It's kind of, it's fair, it's transparent. Everyone knows what's going to happen. And then it comes down, as you said, to, whether people can actually do that. Somewhere like Alamein, after the battle, loads of mines, unexploded ordnance, going in there and marking these graves. It's a dangerous job. It's not a very pleasant thing. And, I think these kind of unsung heroes, not only during the war, but after the war as well. Imagine digging up bodies that have already been buried and moving them and reburying them in the cold, in the wet. I mean, the accounts from the teams that went over to the Western Front, they got there in about September 1944. So the fighting is still, it's only just finished in terms of the Normandy campaign. And they've got, a tin shed and a couple of guys and a couple of spades. There isn't this big organisation. It's pretty hand to mouth. And, the local area is pretty devastated. And they have to go around trying to do this work of creating these cemeteries. I think the one thing that they did give them was a chauffeur, because if you left your car, they had a car to go around. If they left it unattended, the petrol would be nicked, the tyres would be nicked, it'd be stripped. So the one thing they gave them was a chauffeur. But yeah, I mean, and this went on for years. It was only really in the 1950s that people were able to get into Africa, into the Far East, and start this process of trying to find graves. And you imagine what the conditions would have been like, somewhere like the Burma Railway, along the Burma Railway, trying to go and find those graves in the jungle. I mean, it's unimaginable. And it's something that when you see these kind of perfect manicured lawns, in some ways it does disguise that fact. It disguises that kind of grim reality of what this was all about. This isn't a kind of This isn't something that you can kind of gloss over. This was really a grim business. And although these places are beautiful and they give people that succour and that sense that they'll be taken care of, and that they know that there will always be flowers laid on their son's grave, the process to get there, is long and it's hard, and it carries on today, of course.
Now, a couple of years ago, I was involved in a thing called Dig Hill 80, where we did an archaeological dig in a place called White Sheet outside Ypres, and
Witzkatte.
White Sheet, and this dig. I went out on one of the last days of the thing, and it was an absolutely shocking place to visit. The locals said, "Oh, there's an army in this hill, in these hills, buried in these hills," and it's one of those places where when you turn the soil in your garden for your spuds, you end up having to put bones out for the bones people that come round and do this. And we found a couple of imperial soldiers. I think we found a South African and a Kiwi guy. It's mainly Germans, hundreds of Germans in this place. What happens if you find a body now? What's the process now?
Well, that is a really good question, and it still goes on in quite significant numbers. And you're talking about dozens of bodies that are discovered every year, sometimes in big numbers. So at Messines recently, there was a big group of New Zealanders found. All across the former Western Front, this is still happening, and further afield as well. There are still air crews from the Second World War who crashed in places like Norway, maybe North Russia, and their graves are still being kind of discovered and recovered today. So there's a process that goes on with the War Graves Commission, with the military of whichever country is involved, whether it's Australia or Canada or the UK. There's a process of identification often for various countries. Different countries do it differently. So the Australians are very keen on DNA testing. The UK not so much. It's much harder to do in the UK. You need a very close match before, a kind of sample before you can match it against that. Again, it's the kind of CSI issue. Everyone thinks DNA solves everything, and you can get an easy answer from the DNA. That's not necessarily the case. But it's effectively the same thing happens now that happened in the First World War. People are given a military grave in a cemetery, the same headstone. If the family can be found, they're given a chance to provide an inscription. So it's that same job, effectively, that hasn't changed over 100 years. And it still happens with the same kind of dignity and the same kind of honour as it did then.
And what about Remembrance? And what about, as it's Remembrance Sunday? Obviously COVID has put pay to travel to the Western Front and to a lot of the cemeteries and stuff, but just take COVID out of it, take this last anomaly year out of it. Footfall is still pretty good, isn't it, of people visiting cemeteries?
Yeah, it's huge. And certainly the centenary of the First World War led to a huge upshot, not just of people visiting, but people finding more information about their family members. You think how much we've got now through the internet, through looking at kind of genealogical stuff, watching things like Who Do You Think You Are? There's been a huge upsurge in that kind of individual research from just ordinary people, and that again leads to interest and visiting. And the Second World War, of course, we've just got past, or we're reaching the time when the last veterans are going to be leaving us. And that's a really important moment. That time is gone now for the First World War. And I think, it's important for us to think about what this looks like in 25 years' time, in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time. And I think, for me, Remembrance and, all these, every year we have this debate about poppies and all of this stuff. But I think in some ways that often gets in the way of us thinking properly about what this means to us. And, for me, Remembrance is about two different things. It's partly about emotion and that, that feeling of being moved and genuine emotion. But also it's about understanding and about trying to understand the world in which these people lived and the war that they fought and why they fought and the effects of that war. And I think if you have one without the other, there's a problem there, because that emotion is going to diminish as we move further away.
And Remembrance can manifest itself as a form of protest too, because what was happening in Royal Wootton Bassett during the last phase of the Afghan adventure, if you want to call it, whatever it was, conflict war, those crowds gathering to welcome those servicemen back, that was a protest as much as it was anything else, wasn't it? It was people turning out and saying, this shouldn't be happening. This is wrong. And I think Well, I think I personally think one of the upsurges in Remembrance that we are experiencing, and the poppy debate aside, is I think people really grasping how ghastly the war was in a way that maybe had been shoved to one side, because after all, post-war, and we've talked about this a lot, James and I, that the decades following the war, the people who fought the war, like, right, I'm glad that's over. We need to get on with our lives, rebuilding our country. I'd rather not talk about it, thanks very much, because it was horrible. And that what's happened generationally is a sort of understanding of what a hideous event this was. And that's where Remembrance it also forms a sort of form of protest. Don't do this again, politicians. That's a lot of what's happening in Remembrance, I think, and always was. As much as the glorious dead and bugles and all that, it's as much to do with saying, you better not do this again, thank you very much.
Yeah, and at the time there were people saying, as Edmund Blunden put it, why spend money on the dead? We've got plenty of people who are living, dependents, families, pensions, all of that stuff. The idea that this is somehow new. There were veterans' protests at the cenotaph soon after it was erected. The idea that this is somehow one view of this and that there should be no debate I think the one thing that I think we've seen in recent years is a huge upsurge in understanding about the nature of the war effort. The kind of people who are involved, particularly from around the Empire and the Commonwealth. I think far more people are aware now that there were Indian soldiers, Sikhs, Muslims, all of this kind of thing. And of course that has an impact on debates and understanding today.
But today on Remembrance Sunday, do you, Glyn and Al, do you have a particular grave that you would like to visit if you could and bow your head? And do you see it as a whole? I mean, I always stand down in my when I'm here, I kind of go down to the village war memorial and think about that. But I always find myself, because I didn't know any of the people who died from this village, I always find myself thinking of particular people that I've written about or I've come across, or graves that I've visited. And it's knowing that we were going to be talking about it today, I've been sort of thinking about some of the graves that I've visited, Keith Douglas, the great poet who's buried at Tilly Sassoul, and obviously that chap from the Dorsets at Kohima, and several others. And I was reminded about Alex Mackey, who was this very unremarkable Hurricane pilot on Malta in January 1942. He took off for a test flight in a Hurricane, and 4 Messerschmitt 109s had flown over from Sicily and come in under the radar. And just as he was taken off from Tacali airfield, he was hammered, and his Hurricane was in a very, very bad way. And obviously he didn't have much height to play with because he'd only just taken off. And he curved around the hills and got into this beautiful, beautiful valley. And at the end of this valley, there's a rise, and beyond that is the Dingley Cliffs. And if he'd got that, he possibly could have bailed out okay. And what happens is he goes into this beautiful valley and hits and loses control and hits this big wall of this old, what had once been a kind of sort of monastery garden, and gets flung out of the harness, snaps, and he's flung about 25 yards ahead of the crashed Hurricane, and he's still alive. On the other side of the valley is this tiny little church, and the people at the church see him, and they get a wooden ladder and go and get him, use the ladder as a stretcher and take him up to and call an ambulance. An ambulance comes down, takes him up to Imtafa Hospital, where he dies 3 or 4 days later. When I was first researching my book on the Siege of Malta in the Second World War, it was the first history book I'd ever done. And literally one of the first folders I looked at when I first went to the Imperial War Museum, which was the first bit of research I did, was of a senior sister at Imtafa Hospital, and she'd kept all her papers. And amongst her papers was a letter from Alex Mackey's mother. And obviously she had written to her saying, very sorry about your son. I want you to know he didn't suffer, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, she wrote this letter back saying, thank you so much for sending it to me. And the last paragraph said, one day when this cruel war is over, I'm going to visit Malta and see where my boy is buried. And I remember the hairs on the back of my neck just standing up and just thinking, oh my God. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I then visited Malta and went to the wonderful aviation museum at Tacali, and was talking to Ray Polidano and Frederick Galea there, who were the guys who were running it at the time. And I was recounting this story, and Frederick said to me, he said, "Follow me," and we went to this sort of dusty corner of the museum. And he said, and there was sort of bits of old aircraft and bits of sort of mangled Hurricane. And he said, that is the remains of Alex Mackey's Hurricane. And he said, I can show you exactly where it was he came across. And the hole in the wall in that beautiful, beautiful valley, possibly the most beautiful valley anywhere in Malta, is still there where his Hurricane crashed. And obviously I then went to go and visit his grave. So I did go and see his grave. And some years ago, his great niece or one of his family members collared me at the Chalk Valley History Festival. And it was wonderful to have that sort of completion of that story, the story that sort of started me, that human story that started me on the kind of journey I've been on with the Second World War, in terms of kind of talking about it and writing about it and so on, to then have that kind of relative. And so I kind of always think about him whenever it comes to Remembrance Sunday.
Well, for me, it's my grandfather, and who was killed at Hazebrouck, and in 1940, and they were buried by the 6 guys were men from the Ox and Bucks, from the Bucks Battalion, were buried by the orphanage janitor in secret in the town, and then after the war they were reinterred in the graveyard in the village. I think there's half a dozen, or maybe a few more, CWGC graves in a row with my grandfather and some other lads. And we went there in 2008, 9, something like that. Went and had a look when they did the commemoration. And I just sort of think of him as, he wasn't a soldier. He was a regular person. He was hadn't chosen the soldier's life. The war had chosen him. My mother never knew him because he was killed before she was born. And that's what I think about on Remembrance Sunday. I think about him, and I think about and then his brother-in-law was killed in Burma with the Gloucesters. I think about my grandmother and what the war did to her, and how her life. In a way, if you're killed, you don't get to carry the burden of the aftermath. You leave it behind. But she had to live with losing her brother and her husband. And that I think of my grandfather, but I think of my grandmother really when I think of Remembrance. It's that her life, she lived in remembrance, and recall and commemoration, which are all slightly different things, of course. That's what I think of with the silence is her life and what the impact it must have had on her.
Well, like you, James, writing Citizen Sailors, I use loads of diaries and letters. And very often, of course, with sailors with the Royal Navy, there's no grave. The names, if you're lost at sea, your name will be on a naval memorial at Portsmouth, Plymouth or Chatham. And one that I particularly remember was a chap called Ian Anderson, who was a submariner, HMS Odin, out of Malta. And he died on their very first kind of trip out to sea, against the Italians. And of course, he'd written a letter to be sent home in the event that he died, that he never came back. And I remember reading that letter in the War Museum, and I'm not sure I could read it now. It does bring you to tears. But I also remember very vividly on D-Day, the anniversary of D-Day, 75th anniversary last year. Very early in the morning, I was in Bayeux War Cemetery. Just walking around, taking in the atmosphere. The sun was just coming up. And I spotted the grave of a Royal Marine called Edward Dern, who died on the 6th of June on D-Day. He was 17 years old. And the inscription that his family had chosen for the grave was, "Into the mosaic of victory, our most precious piece was laid." And for me, that speaks so much to so many things. All of those
wonderful
different people who made such sacrifices in all kinds of different ways.
You're getting me choked up just thinking.
I know, it's difficult, isn't it? But yeah.
Glyn, thank you so much for talking to us today. There is something very special about talking to someone who really does know the subject inside out, and such an important one. That's different to our usual diet of Merlin engines and cavity magnetrons. So thank you very much, and lots of food for thought, actually. Things to think about, things to reflect on a day like today. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Well, I don't know about you, but I think that was an absolutely fascinating conversation and lots of food for thought. And so what James and I thought we'd do today is do a couple of short readings for you. I've picked a bit of Spike Milligan. It's a short section, but it's when his favourite officer, Tony Goldsmith, is killed and how he feels about that. And then James will be reading a poem by Keith Douglas. 24th of April. Fighting on Long Stop at a crescendo all day. OP under murderous fire. Support group at bottom of hill also under heavy shell fire. Gunner Collins hit in hand. At about 11:10 I heard the dreadful news. Lieutenant Goldsmith had been killed. Alf Fildes noted in his diary, "Learn with regret we have lost our best officer." I went back to my cave and wept. I remember calling his name. After a few minutes I straightened up, but the memory of that day remains vivid. Apparently he and Bombardier Edwards were sheltering in a foxhole. We were under mortar attack. We sat facing each other, our knees touching. Tony had the mapboard on his chest, his arms folded round it. Suddenly I was blown out of the trench. I went to get back in and saw that Tony had been hit by a mortar bomb in the chest. He died instantly. All the boys came back very shaken. God knows how the infantry stick that for 2 weeks at a time. Bombardier Dodds was so bomb-happy he went to hospital and never came back. For someone as splendid, kind, intelligent and witty as Tony to be killed outraged by sensibilities. His friend, Terence Rattigan, wrote a personal obituary in the Times. I remember his last words to me. He was about to leave for Long Stop. "It won't be long now. I'd say Tunis in 10 days. He was patting his pockets. "Blast, I'm out of cigarettes." I gave him 5 of mine. "Here, sir, have 5 of my soap-saturated passing clouds. A holy medal in every packet." He took them, smiled, tapped the driver on the shoulder and said, "To battle."
So this is a poem called Vergiss my nicht, and it's by Keith Douglas, who was a member of my favourite regiment, the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, until he was killed in Normandy on the 8th of June 1944. But before that, he'd been in North Africa. He was probably the greatest war poet that Britain produced during the Second World War. I don't know whether he's underrated or not, but he certainly wrote some amazing poetry. He was also a very talented artist. And on top of that, wrote a fabulous memoir called Alamein to Zemzem, which I think we've talked about before, but it's really fabulous. Anyway, this is called Vergiss my nicht. 3 weeks gone and the combatants gone. Returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again and found the soldier sprawling in the sun, the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Look, here in the gun pit spoil, the dishonoured picture of his girl who has put Steffi, vergiss my nicht in a copybooked Gothic script. We see him almost with content, abased and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on the skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt.
Well, we hope you liked those. We thought that the best way to end the podcast today is with the last post and Reveille and some silence. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time. Cheerio.